Hello everyone, welcome to Bold Conjectures with Paras Chopra. Today I'm with Patrick Mineault, an independent scientist working at the intersection of neuroscience and deep learning. He did his PhD in visual neuroscience from McGill University. He's worked at Google as a scientist and then worked with Facebook to build brain-machine interfaces. Most recently, he's helped build NeuroMatch Academy, an online summer school on computational neuroscience. I highly recommend you check it out. The content is exhaustive, and you cover almost everything there is to sort of cover in computational neuroscience, and it's all free. So really amazing content. On his famous blog xcore.net, he writes about the rapidly accelerating merger of techniques in AI and neuroscience. This field, we don't have a name for it yet, but people have started calling it neuroAI. It aims to study how the brain works by studying artificial intelligence, and particularly deep learning techniques and artificial neural networks. So AI and neuroscience are two of my favorite topics. So there's lots to unpack here in this episode. And I couldn't think of a better person than Patrick to talk about the promise that this new field of neuro AI holds. Welcome, Patrick.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. So let's just get right into the definition. How do you define neuro AI? It's a new field. So what do you sort of club together when you talk about neuro AI as a term?
Yeah, I think that the neuroAI as a field obviously is a very heterogeneous thing, but consists of that intersection of neuroscience, which is the study of the brain, and artificial intelligence, which is how do you create intelligence inside of a machine, which is not a brain, and how these two things relate to each other. It's certainly been the goal for, I think, a very, very long time in the field of artificial intelligence to make intelligent machines, right? And one of the ways that we can make intelligent machines is to take inspiration from the brain. So a lot of the field of neuroAI is, what can we learn about the brain that will allow us to make intelligent machines? But there's another part of neuroAI, which is what can we know about artificial intelligence that allows us to learn more about how we as humans become or are intelligent. So there's kind of a bidirectional interaction in between these two fields. And it's really been growing exponentially in the last few years as the tools have become better, as, of course, deep learning has really revolutionized that field. And the field is just growing bigger. So some of the now I should say that neuroAI is a field that's existed for a long time. So the premier conference in artificial intelligence is, of course, NeurIPS, right? But the thing about NeurIPS is that "neur" inside of NeurIPS means neural. It's neural information processing systems. So originally, it was a neuroscience and AI conference in the early 90s. It was started by Terry Sojnowski, who's at UCSD. So people were really looking at that intersection of these two things. But eventually it kind of really focused in on artificial intelligence, and that's what it is today. But there is a tiny sliver of it which is still about neuroscience. And we have other conferences as well, where you can explore these kinds of things. There's Maine, there's CCM, and we can place some links later if people are interested in learning more about this field and kind of get like a little sampling of all the different approaches that people are using to tackle this question.
Right. So before we get into some of the techniques in neuro AI, I wanted to spend a little bit of time maybe discussing a bit of philosophy in the sense of what does understanding even mean for, when we're trying to talk about neuro AI, one is neuroscience, brain, and the other is deep learning networks. And both are notoriously really hard things to understand.
Yeah, what happens when you replace one black box with another black box?
Yeah, so in that sense, what does understanding mean? When you're sort of talking about let's understand brain using deep learning networks, what exactly are we doing there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's important to recognize that there are a variety of goals when you're modeling something. And with respect to the kind of approach of neuroAI that I'm particularly interested in and I've done in the past, I think that maybe the person that's done the best work of really laying out a framework for how you do these approaches is Jessica Thompson, who was at Mila. Now I believe she's at Oxford. But basically created a framework in which there are different goals that one could have when you evaluate different kinds of neural networks and how they relate to brains. One thing that you can evaluate is whether this neural network that you have, let's say it's a neural network that does object recognition, and you're asking, is it like the brain? So first of all, can it perform a task that humans can perform? So if it does that, that's a big check mark that you can say, okay, so now we have like a model of object recognition. Well, that's like one level of understanding. Another level of understanding is to say like, we can relate this information to neural activity, like one-to-one. We can actually do quantitative measurements. Okay, so that's another checkbox that we can check. Now, an entire other different kind of checkbox is to say like, well, this network is biologically plausible. Like I can say how this network has, like how it relates to different parts which are actually implemented biology and what it looks like in terms of synapses and brain areas, and neurons, and like actual neurons, physical neurons, not like ReLU units. And a final thing that we can do is to say, well, maybe this network, here's a plausible picture for how it could have evolved, through natural evolution. And so, which is like yet another level of realism. So when we're talking about understanding the brain through neural networks, there's a whole hierarchy of factors, and it's possible to address one without addressing the other. In my mind, it's a little bit like the Aristotelian picture of causes, right? So you have like a lot of different ways that you can define cause, and some of them are kind of more useful in some contexts than others.
Right. So you're saying that we have a number of constraints, maybe inspired from biology, and if our artificial models satisfy some of those constraints, then probably we can make a claim that we understand something. Maybe they perform similar functions, or maybe they sort of model neural activity. So these constraints, if they're fulfilled, then we can claim to understand something.
Yeah, exactly. And how deep you want to go into this rabbit hole, like, really depends. So when you say it's biologically plausible, okay, so there's very, very different levels of biological plausibility. One is that, okay, maybe I can identify like which area of the brain this corresponds to in the network. So like I have like an association. It's biologically plausible, like, okay, these things aren't done in a vacuum. Okay, well, that's cool. Maybe another level would be, well, I have inhibitory cells and excitatory cells in my network. So that's good. Right. So that's like one level of realism. Another one is to say, oh, well, actually, like my network has noise. It has biophysically realistic noise. So that's another level of realism. Maybe it has some heterogeneity. Maybe it has, the way that it learns is similar to a brain. So it's not gradient descent, but it's something like a local learning rule. And then you can go down like way down that rabbit hole as far as you can. So like you can say each of my units actually has like a physical implementation, and it has like real synapses and dendrites and axons, and it looks like this, and it has like this concentration of this neurotransmitter, and so you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And what it does is really it looks at the hypothesis space, which is gigantic, and just chops it off like one at a time. And depending on which neuroscientist and which artificial intelligence researcher you're going to ask, they're going to care a lot more about some parts of the space than others.
Right. So let's say we have this model that satisfies a number of constraints, and it works reasonably well on those different constraints. What then? What do we do with that model?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that I think that there's kind of a bit of a there's an assumption in the field, which is often unspoken, that if we could only like really model the brain really well, something would happen that would allow us to do something else. But that something else is sometimes a little bit ill-defined. One of the things that the field often, I think, often thinks that will be achieved is to make better artificial intelligence models. So here, the model is really, sorry, not a model, but the canonical example of something like that happening is convolutional neural networks. So there's a long history of convolutional neural networks and how they appeared. The short story is that Hubel and Wiesel, who were two neuroscientists at Harvard, were the first to record from the primary visual cortex. And when they recorded in the primary visual cortex, they saw two different kinds of cells. One type of cell, the simple cell, was selective for different kinds of orientation in a particular part of the visual field. But what was particular about that is it really cared about what's the sign of the contrast. So for instance, am I like a white line but not a black line, or vice versa? And then the other type of cell, the complex cell, also liked orientation, but in this case did not care about the sign of the contrast. And so based off of that, they said, well, okay, so here's what's probably happening. The simple cell receives a lot of information from the previous area and just essentially receives and weighs the right inputs in the right way, and then thresholds that information. And then several of these cells, one which is selected for white line, one's for black lines, one for edges that go white to black, and the other for edges that go black to white, are added. Their outputs are added, and that creates the complex cell. And that complex cell now is selective for orientation, but it has lost the ability, or rather now it's invariant or equivariant to the sign of contrast. And so people looked at that and said, oh, well, maybe the same process is happening all over the brain. Maybe we just have a selectivity operation and an invariance operation, and we just stack these one on top of the other. And so the first person to really formalize this was Fukushima in 1982, I believe, with the neocognitron. And then Jan LeCun picked it up to make the modern CNN in the late 80s, early 90s with Linette. And then eventually, that became the first generation of neural nets that had success on solving ImageNet problems, right? On solving image recognition problems with, of course, the famous work from Alex Kuzevsky et al. In 2012 that solved this mysterious problem. How do you do object recognition with these machines? And so that was the first time that they were able to beat handcrafted information or handcrafted features. And from then onward, it's been, deep neural nets all the way. But that nudge, that little nugget of information, which is the brain is composed of these operations, simple, complex, simple, complex, simple, complex. I mean, it was very important in that generation of the deep learning revolution. So I think that people still have the hope that there are more principles that we can mine out of the brain. The other common example is reinforcement learning. And for people who are interested in this, there's a great paper that where the senior author is Demis Hassabis, of course, the CEO of DeepMind, that goes through, in particular, the CNN example, NRL, and exposes like what he thinks are the next big things that could be uncovered by just studying the brain deeply and more deeply. Maybe you could uncover principles that could be helpful for making intelligent machines.
Right. So of course, I think in the last 10 years or so, deep learning itself has become its own field, somewhat detached from neuroscience. It's seen amazing progress with things like GPT-3 and so on. So has there been a reverse sort of push, or like neuroscience importing insights from independent progress of deep learning and AI? Has there been the cases, just like convolution networks were sort of exported to AI?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there's so on one hand, there are very like pragmatic, like everyday tasks that can now be automated, which weren't automatable before, and that's allowed to get a lot more information about how humans and animals interact with the world. So I think computational ethology is a super interesting field, and it was hampered by this technical limitation. I mean, computational ethology is it sounds very fancy, but it's really, really simple. The idea is like, what if we place like 3 cameras, and then you just like, let's say in my kitchen, and you just like watch me all day. Like, what do I do exactly? And that can tell you a lot about what it is to be a human. I guess like what it is to be a human that plays on his laptop all day, and every once in a while stands up and eats nuts and sits back down and programs. The problem, of course, is the labeling problem. So in that case, it was really solved by advances in labeling bodies and to be able to do tracker-free labeling. So we've seen like an explosion. There's a particular paper from Mackenzie Mattis who that has been cited already thousands of times, and it's only 3 years old. So that whole field was completely enabled by the deep learning revolution. That's very much in the pick and axes kind of way of thinking about deep learning, as I can make new tools. These tools are helpful, and with that, I can learn new information about what it is to be a human or an animal. And so certainly that's been very helpful. But some people might argue, well, that's a little bit superficial, like who cares? Or, well, I don't think that people actually say that, yeah. But it is, but maybe it's not like really, that kind of, right. Of like really deep insight that we're looking into. Yeah. But I personally think that we've made tons of progress in understanding sensory systems because of these advances in artificial intelligence, and we can definitely go into that.
I would love to. I mean, my sense was more about, say, for example, looking at how transformers enable translation, or how sort of GPT-3 is able to hold a coherent conversation, and in fact, training without labels, GPT-3 is able to sort of infer a lot of context about English language. So has there been attempts to study how that artificial model works to infer how, say, brain might be doing similar things like picking up language as a child?
Yeah, so I think that I'm pretty dubious that GPT-3 is a model of the brain in any, kind of meaningful sense. Although, what it does is pretty amazing, and you can use it for a lot of very interesting things. But the reason I'm so dubious is that it's trained on 10,000 times more data than a human child would ever be. So how could it ever happen that, these two things are kind of equivalent? But also, the setting in which human children learn language is a very different setting than the kinds of unsupervised learning that people are doing with GPT-3. So for those that might not have a lot of context, so GPT-3 is so first of all, it's trained on all the data that's ever been produced, like in terms of text, since the beginning of humankind ever.
It's a lot of text.
Which is tons and tons and tons of tokens. I think it was, I want to say 500 billion tokens.
Yeah, I think it's that similar order, 400, 500 billion tokens.
Yeah, it's completely ridiculous, right? So that means every encyclopedia, every book that's ever been written, all of Wikipedia, and basically all of the web, like 70% of the web deduped and cleaned up, and with the weird parts cut out, which is a lot of the web. And that's what it's trained on. So clearly a human child would never have like that information. That would be one smart child. That would be awesome to speak to this child. But unfortunately, it is not the case that human children are really ever trained with that amount of information. And then if you look at the task that the transformer network actually does, it does like a mass prediction task, right? So basically you And now I forget the details, whether it's like a bidirectional mask or it's a unidirectional mask. But one of the versions of the task is I give you, the start of a sentence, like Mary add a little, and then I ask you, like, what's the probability distribution of the things after that? And then if you say lamp, that's probably has like 0.99 probability, and then anything else has a variable probability. So if you just learn to do this thing recursively over and over again, you're going to get pretty good at generating sentences which make sense and which have like a lot of context. But it's very different from a human child, because the human child has, first of all, it has different stages of learning, right? So it's the human child is an agent. Let's start with that premise. That's huge. GPT-3 is not an agent flavor, whereas a human child, if it doesn't understand a thing, can keep asking questions, which is amazing. You can imagine like a 2-year-old that's like pointing at a dog, and like the dog is kind of like especially fluffy or whatever, and it thinks it's a cat, and then it's dog. No, it's actually a cat. Or vice versa. And it's like, oh, really? And like, what about this? Is this a dog? And then it's, yes, that's a dog. It's just like this one has like very long hair, and you see, but it's still a cat. Look at its face. Right? So you can have this conversation. So there's a process of iterative refinement. The thing is that people introduce different curricula to children as they're growing older. So at first, people use very inflected speech, and so they'll speak in a kind of sing-song manner, and have like very like baby-oriented speaking, and they will say words very slowly, and they will make sure that the child is looking at them. And then as they grow older, they'll introduce like larger and larger vocabularies, and then so on in schooling. So there's all these different sub-processes that come from the fact that the child can interrogate the world and learn about it themselves. The fact that there's a curriculum that happens that goes from very simple to a lot more complicated. The fact that the child can have conversations, right, and get their own training signal, and the fact that they have 10,000 times less data than GPT-3 would ever use. I mean, I would be curious, right, like, hypothetically, if human children could grow up in instead of 5 years, would be like 50,000 years, so they would have the time to be exposed to all this data. What would it be like to talk to one of these children? It's just like a weird philosophy question.
Sounds like a good science fiction plot.
Yes, exactly.
So I hear you say GPT-3 and similar models might not be a good model for the brain, because brain uses a very different way of learning. But a lot of people who've tried to sort of implement these techniques like predictive coding or being reinforcement agent based sort of learning methodologies, they've not sort of matched performance of straightforward models like GPT-3. So I mean, that's a dilemma, right, where you could have a lot of human like AI models, but so far I'm not sure if, I might be mistaken, but so far I'm not sure if they've performed really well on things that just straightforward deep learning models have.
Yeah. So I think that there has been a transition in different parts of our, in different subfields, where people first start to work with supervised learning, right? So supervised learning models are generally the ones that accomplish, basically, they ask the question, how do I accomplish a task? I accomplish the task by accomplishing the task. It's a very simple principle, right? Like, how do you do the thing? You do the thing, and then you get good at it. So, if I want to solve image recognition, I train a network to solve image recognition. Boom, super, super simple. So there's a lot less kind of fiddling and a lot less free parameters that come with that. And so historically, those have been the approaches that have worked better and more reliably. There have been like a few blips here and there in history where maybe we don't really like supervised learning anymore. Maybe we want to do unsupervised learning. So some of the modern deep learning revolutions, so in 2005 2006, they were usually trained using not variational method but energy-based methods as using a Gibbs sampling approach, which was very different from modern supervised learning. But then, and they called it pre-training. But these days we don't do that anymore because we have a bunch of tricks that can do it directly with supervised learning. So supervised learning works great. It's not a biologically realistic way of learning things. I think that's the kind of consensus. People hate this idea that there's something that sounds like giving a child 1,000 examples of 1,000 different categories. They're like, this is like, there's no way that ever happens, right? Which is so what I'm describing, of course, is ImageNet. But there's like one category in ImageNet that's like, let's say, a Rottweiler. Another one's a bulldog. So I think, like, first of all, like, would a child ever see like 1,000 instances of a Rottweiler versus a bulldog? Yeah. Okay, so there's that problem. But also, they probably wouldn't get labels. So generally, people think like, okay, supervised learning is not like really biologically realistic, but maybe that doesn't matter because there's something deeper in this fact that these two things, that the brain and this network are kind of doing the same thing. And it's kind of a teleological idea. The network or the brain was built to solve problem X, and by correlating it with this network, you can infer what that X is, and that's super cool because we just know that the brain helps us survive. That's for sure. But anything else is kind of fair game at this point. So if you say, well, out of 1 billion different networks that I looked at, the ones that were trained to do object recognition in a supervised manner were most similar to the brain compared to every other task that I could throw at it, whether it's 3D segmentation or 2D segmentation, semantic segmentation, figuring out textures, 3D mapping, what have you. Then you can say, like, maybe the brain really does object recognition, and that's okay. Whoa, that's something. That now you can say this brain area or this set of brain areas is really like nicely tuned for this problem. What does it mean for us as human agents that are trying to interact with the world? What does it mean that we naturally evolved this thing, which was good, this particular task? Maybe it teaches us about the kinds of environment that we grew up in, or, what the human experience is. So there's still something like very deep that you can do with supervised learning. But then you can't turn around and say, and therefore, children receive, and now we have like a new government program in which we just like give a photo book with 1 million images to children so that they can really learn visual recognition very well.
So it's supervised learning is definitely sort of like not how the brain works. So you in your sort of recent post where you've written how the field is progressing, I think one thing is clearly evident. You were excited about unsupervised methods having similar performance as supervised methods as far as modeling brain's vision system is concerned. So can you talk a little bit more about it? Why do you think it represents like a big step up?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, the easiest way to do the thing is by doing the thing. That is a generalized consensus in deep learning. However, every once in a while, people figure out how to do the thing by doing something completely different, and which is unsupervised learning. So if you want to solve object recognition, why don't you learn how to represent distribution of textures and images? And maybe, there's a lot more information there, and so you don't need to leverage the labels of the objects so much. And the labels, of course, are very expensive, whereas the images themselves are super cheap to acquire. So that's the general calculus. Unsupervised learning is harder because you're doing things in an indirect fashion. But if it works well, it could potentially work a lot better than supervised learning, which is easier because it's more direct, but hits a wall because there's only so much information to go around. And so in order to be able to say we have unsupervised networks or unsupervised trained networks that are as good as the brain, the first thing to do is we should have unsupervised trained networks, which are as good as supervised trained networks. The reason is that the match already between supervised trained networks and the brain for at least some areas and for some vision processes are excellent already. So if you start with something that's just like not very good at the task of object recognition, it's very hard. Like you're not going to get very far there. And so in the last 3 years or so, there's been a veritable revolution in self-supervised and unsupervised learning that has allowed people to create networks that are very good at image recognition, but are trained mostly in an unsupervised or self-supervised manner. And they just add a little bit of a sprinkling of supervised training on top. We hear a lot about, so you might know about MoCo, about SimClear. Like there's all these like weird acronyms that people come up with. I think the one that people may be more generally aware because there's been like a very nice blog post by OpenAI is CLIP.
Yeah.
So, I think that between CLIP and DALL-E, there's been a lot of art also that's been created with these networks. So that's an example of a network that's trained in a self-supervised manner, in a contrastive manner, CLIP. So the way it works is you do a big crawl of the internet and you find images and text that's close to these images. And then instead of trying to predict the text directly, what you try to do is to predict a kind of a low-dimensional version of the information that's in the text. So it's a kind of a soft labels if you will. And by doing that, you actually get very good representations, which are useful for a lot of different things. So that's an example of something that's a multimodal thing because it uses both text and images, and it doesn't have it's not nearly as problematic, I think, as a supervised network, in terms of the labeling.
To capture what you're saying, essentially the first part of what you were saying, supervised networks, they match brain. But of course, they require labels. And by matching brain, it means they do things like recognize objects as well as a brain would do, like a primate brain. And also, they can be used to predict the direct recordings, neural recordings as well, which means...
Yeah, precisely. So there's there's different levels of explanation. One of them is they do something that the brain does. Another one is they literally you can predict the brain activity. So for instance, if I show you an image, and I can predict what the brain activity is going to be for that image.
Yeah, I mean, that was very surprising for me when I was reading the paper. Why should that be possible?
Oh, it's bizarre. I think everybody agrees that it's a weird thing that's going on there. But I think there's a lot of underlying hypotheses why this is the case. Like maybe if you're going to try and solve the same kind of task as the brain does, well, naturally you will do it in kind of a equivalent way to how the brain does it. I think that people like to think of that. Maybe the fact is that these networks, they're kind of are like the brain in some ways. They have multiple stages. And they have both invariance and selectivity operations. So they're close enough that they remain kind of close in the idea space or in the manifold space to what you would expect in the brain.
But the learning algorithm seem to be very different. I mean, one is back propagation and
backprop. I don't
from
think
what I know in the brain, back propagation might not be possible.
Yeah, I think that people really like to do a separation of concerns when it comes to these things. Like, so people like to say, okay, we're going to solve like this problem. We're going to find a network that is as good as the brain at doing this task. Great. And then another paper is going to tackle, I want to find an algorithm that can learn a task as good as an artificial neural network, but that doesn't use any sort of gradient descent. So it uses some other like trace algorithm that is purely local and doesn't have like all these difficulties that you have with the stochastic gradient descent. But there is still the integration work, I think, of taking all of these things together to create like the ultimate mega model that eats everything. Right. There's a lot of things that you would want in that model. It would have to not have stochastic gradient descent. It would have to have excitatory and inhibitory neurons and follow Dale's law, which is that excitatory neurons make excitatory connections, inhibitory neurons make inhibitory connections. It would have to have recurrence. It would have to have multiple areas. It would have to have like a frontal lobe that talks back to infratemporal cortex. It would have to have like multiple passes throughout. It would be like kind of a mess. So I think that people are pretty wisely attacking one of these things at a time, and just like punting in the near future, we'll have like all of these elements together.
Right.
My feeling is that if you really put all of these elements together, you're going to have like a great brain model, which is going to be kind of impossible to even think about. It's going to be just as bad as the real brain.
So coming back to again what I was saying, so we have a supervised model that works, that matches quite well with the brain, and but obviously there's this big dissonance because brain doesn't get so many labels, thousands of labels per category. So the big progress that's happening recently is matching supervised models performance and match, but without the labels. Just
yeah, absolutely.
But do you, I mean, when you talked about CLIP, I think CLIP also uses millions and millions of images. But of course,
that is very true. Yeah. So,
I gave human brain. I mean, the child wouldn't get so many images. So isn't there still like a gap between what a child gets and what an unsupervised model gets as data?
Yeah. So I think some of the best work, like really tackling this question. So when I say like people really hate supervised learning as a model of how the brain learns, I really mean it. Like they're just like viscerally, like it just doesn't make any sense. Whereas unsupervised learning can maybe make sense if all the things kind of align. Do you understand? Like supervised learning like wouldn't even work in principle. Right. Like you could just like it's not how the brain could possibly work. Unsupervised learning, it's really it really is a matter of the devil's in the details. Like you mentioned, well, how many samples do you have? So sure, GPT-3 is trained in an unsupervised fashion, but it uses 10,000 times more tokens than a child has. Not biologically plausible. So I think that Talia Conquil has a great paper, and if people want to read the discussion in particular for like how would you actually implement like for realsies in a brain this unsupervised method, and I think one of the big conclusions from that is that maybe the key is saccades. So remember that unsupervised methods, or rather self-supervised methods like SimClear and MoCo and all of that, they generally function on this principle of transformations of images. So one of the big one of the big ways that they function is I take an image, let's say it's an image of a bird, and then I take like a little crop around the bird's face, and then I take like a little crop around the bird's body, and I feed these two things into the network. And I say to the network, make sure that these two things, which are the head of the head of the bird and the body of the bird, are as close to each other as possible. So it basically leverages this idea that generally there's one object in each image that's kind of the main subject, and if you take different crops, you still maintain this identity. So these things should be kind of close to each other in idea space. And then there's another aspect of it, which is make sure that if you take patches from another image, that they're far away from that bird image. So if you just keep doing that, eventually you're going to learn a pretty good representation that is able to solve things like object recognition. So she started with the premise that let's take that seriously, right? Let's take this cropping idea pretty seriously. Like, what would that even look like in the brain? And maybe like the easiest way to create something which kind of looks like cropping is saccades. So we move our eyes in the world every 300 milliseconds or so. So if you're reading a paper, if you're ever at the library, I guess that libraries don't really exist anymore because of COVID. But if you ever have the chance of looking at somebody reading a book, you'll notice that their eyes, they dart, right? So they stay in fixed positions and then they move in these very fast movements that are these ballistic eye movements. And so humans, the reason that people do this is because they have better resolution in the center of the eye than they have in the periphery. So if you just bring the letters to the center of your eye where you have like immense resolution and a bunch of cones, you can read things which are very, very fine. And the saccades could allow you to do this like kind of cropping algorithm in an analog physical way, because you have one snapshot of the world with the sampling which comes from the retina, and then you move your eyes, and then you have another sample of the world. And yet your brain must say, if I move my eyes, just stuff remains about the same. Like I did not radically change the scene. I did not radically change the identity of objects because I just moved my eyes. So
that's a really interesting connection.
Oh, sorry.
I was saying that's a very interesting connection, very intriguing.
So the paper is really nice. There's also this idea of hippocampal replay as another mechanism that maybe you could store a buffer of the image and then kind of replay it too. But again, with the saccades being really part of the equation, so I really like that, because I'm not saying that this is a fully baked proposal, but it is a great example of somebody like really thinking seriously. How would you actually implement this? Like when it gets down to brass tacks, because like we're not in silico, right? It's not, you don't have to write like a for loop in order to go through the iterations and go down the gradient. That's not how it works. Let's say we actually implement this in wetware. What will it actually look like?
Right. Is anyone trying to go one step beyond, as in when we're looking at things, we're not just saccades is one thing, but we actually also physically move our body and we explore the environment. We look at objects from multiple angles by just physically moving in space. So is anyone trying to do that in vision, active sampling through the whole 3D environment?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that's a great segue for some of my own research, which involves exactly this problem. So I'm interested, and I've been interested for a long time, in how the brain perceives motion. So I think that a lot of the research on how brains are similar to artificial neural networks has been focused on object recognition, because it's been mysterious for a very long time, because there are approaches which can solve it in silico. And so there's been a lot of research on that, but we know far less about how the brain can solve motion problems. And historically, or on an evolutionary timescale, motion has always been kind of the most important thing. So not to tut my horn or to say that that motion is the most important problem to study, but it is definitely something that's evolutionarily very important, because even mammals or fish or even invertebrates that barely have a brain will still rely on motion in order to orient themselves. So it's something that's been happening for a very long time. So the question that we looked at is how could you create something which looks like the motion processing system of humans and primates, and like grow that from an objective, right? So could you find an artificial neural network that does motion in kind of the same way that humans do it? And so I don't know if you've ever had the experience of having vertigo.
Yeah.
Right. So vertigo is kind of an interesting thing, because you really see, like, or maybe if you have like a few too much drinks, you see that the entire world maybe spins around you, right? So you have like this illusory motion, and yet it doesn't really happen. So, and it's also like kind of a visceral feeling. And so it's kind of a dysregulation of the information that comes from the eye and the information that comes from the vestibule, which is this inner ear thing that we have that tells us the rotational acceleration as well as the location of gravity. It's our IMU, if you will. So there's this one area in the brain, which is called MST, and it receives inputs from both the vestibular system and also from the motion system. And if you look at what the kinds of things that it responds to, some of these neurons really like exactly like that kind of like weird rotation that you might see as you have vertigo, or they like expansion stimuli, or they like contraction. So the kinds of things that happens as you navigate towards the world. So there's always been this notion that like, hey, maybe what this area is doing is to help us navigate the world. So if I have the intention of going towards one place and I see a lot of motion, let's say I see tons of leftward motion, it means I'm not going in the right direction, because the point where I'm going to is supposed to have no motion. It's like if you watch like a sci-fi movie, then when they do warp speed, in the center, there's no like the stars don't become lines, right? So that center, it doesn't move. So I trained a deep neural network to solve a subtask out of this system, which is essentially to figure out, if you have like a little sequence of images, where was I going? So how fast was my head rotating? And where am I heading about in the world? If you train this in silico with simulation data, so you can train this in the simulation that's made in Unreal Engine, and you can add whatever artifacts you want in this environment. Then you find that the network looks a heck of a lot like what you would see in these motion selective areas in the brain. So they do it in kind of the same sequence. And the sequence goes, first, I care about motion in like a little blip of the visual world, and specifically for a specific orientation. Then I solve motion for larger patches. And there I don't care so much about orientation. I don't care about pattern anymore. And in the third sequence, I care about combinations of motions. So combinations of motions that can create things like rotation and expansion. And so you see this like perfect, almost perfect recapitulation of what the brain does. And it matches both quantitatively and qualitatively. So I think the next step along this journey is to say, well, could you use that for path integration, as you mentioned, right? Could you use it to map out, to do like, does the brain do SLAM, right? So simultaneous localization and mapping, or something like that. And there are certainly people that are working in the hippocampus like really trying to better understand how the brain does maps and so forth. So it would be nice to connect these two things, because that's kind of the idea, is that, well, you do motion, and then as you do motion, you're kind of buffering this information and then putting it inside of a map. But I think the hippocampal side of things is pretty well understood. And now I think the motion side of things is pretty well understood. But what happens in the middle is kind of complex and interesting and messy.
Oh, I mean, it seems really a little surreal that you can have an artificial network trained on a task, and that converges to how brain behaves. I mean, it seems like it should be possible, but yet.
I mean, when I saw the initial results, I was like, this is so wild. I do want to, I think that scientists are often like very, like even tempered when they present this stuff to the public and just say like, well, these are the results, because, we don't want to overinterpret. But I think also as scientists, it can happen that you get results and you're like, I can't believe this actually worked. This is weird. What's happening?
I guess this is, yeah. This is perhaps touching something which is broadly true. Maybe it's capturing the nature of problem itself in some sense, that two different systems are converging to similar behavior, similar structure. It just seems it should be possible, but yet that's what you find. So very crazy.
Yeah.
Great. So, Patrick, since we are almost at the end of the conversation, I did want to talk about the C word, consciousness. I know you have some thoughts, and I know it's also not super polite in neuroscience community to talk about, but what does it all say about consciousness? But but I know you have some thoughts about it. So I wanted to ask, do you think all of this can lead us to understanding consciousness in a much more rigorous way, much more scientifically? Do you have hope for that, or do you think it's still very, very far away?
I personally think that it's very, very far away, but I do think that we'll learn something about what it is to be human in the process of understanding all of these different subsystems, because we'll understand how the senses relate to our internal model of the world, which is kind of how we create behavior and act as humans. This Leibniz famously said that there is nothing in the mind that is not from the senses except for the mind itself. So I do think that by understanding the senses better, we will get to this understanding. But as far as consciousness, I think that there's two big theories which are contenders for theories of consciousness that people are really looking at right now. There's integrated information theory, which is from Tononi. And so if you read the book by the recent book by Neil Seth, and I think you have, because I read your notes, that's the kind of standard theory that's often brought about. And then there's global workspace theory, which is from Stanislas Dehaene, who's a very, very famous French psychologist, who's also written a ton of books. And you should definitely pick up his book, because I do think it's very interesting. So, the question is, by understanding these sensory systems, will they say things that we could relate back to these theories of consciousness that already exist in the world? Could they speak about some of the sub aspects of these theories? And I do think that that's actually possible, that they will say something about it. So, for instance, in global workspace theory, you have this notion that there is essentially a stream of consciousness, and there's a process by which low-level visual information or low-level sensory information can pop out and actually like take over consciousness, right? So it's kind of a process that's like right about a phase transition. So if I present you a stimulus for a certain amount of time, and then I place a distractor, or I place some noise stimulus, maybe you won't see it. But if I just show it to you a little bit more time, it has time to grow and be amplified in the brain until it kind of takes over your consciousness, and then you see the stimulus. So I do think that as we create artificial machines, we'll have we may be able to get models which will tell us what kinds of stimuli will actually be accessible to consciousness. But that's not the, but it's very, very, I can see you're kind of dubious, because I don't think that that's what you think about when, or what most people think about when they think about consciousness, right? Yes, I have the contents of my consciousness. Like, there are certain things that I can see and those that I can't see. And the things that I can see are, I'm conscious of. Fine. But if I have a model of what I can see and what I can't see, sure, it will tell me like things that I'm conscious of and things that I'm not conscious of. But I don't think that's what people are talking about. People are talking about qualia. Like, right. Why does it feel anything to be anything? So
I think both are interesting questions.
Yeah,
the question of
that would be my contention. Exactly.
How does this whole 3D structure get instantiated in brain? I think that's equally interesting as, why does red feel like red? And the qualia question might actually be impossible to answer at the very end, but at least a formal question we can answer. How is this 3D world getting generated inside the head? Yeah. So I was also curious, is anyone doing, just like you said, people are doing, say, building networks or object recognition and finding that these artificial networks match how the brain does. Is anyone trying to actually model consciousness itself in the artificial network and see if that artificial model ends up matching things we observe in our own experience?
I think people are hopeful that this will happen. I personally haven't seen much work that speaks directly to that question, but it would certainly be super interesting. The closest, I think, is some of the work from Anil Seth, which has looked at altered states of consciousness and whether it's possible to kind of induce the kinds of feeling that you get with an altered state of consciousness through an interaction with an artificial neural network. So the classic setup there is, okay, so if you take psychedelics, right, whether it's psilocybin or LSD or DMT, ayahuasca, et cetera, you might have visual hallucinations right there, or you might have like enhancements of your visual perception, which will make you feel strange, for lack of a better word. So he was looking at whether it's possible to recreate these kinds of feelings of strangeness in the visual perception through an artificial neural network assisted method. And so what he chose to do is he used a 360 footage and like a 360 movie that you can present in VR, and then apply Deep Dream, which essentially is a way of, so for you might have seen Deep Dream images already. So there's those funky images where you take like a basic image and then you kind of crank it up to 11, and then everything becomes eyes and faces of dogs and so on and so forth. So you can certainly use a search engine to look at some Deep Dream images right now. It's very similar to that process. So they're inside of a VR headset, the subjects, and then they undergo this, and they looked at whether people had experiences which were along some axes similar to the psychedelic experience. So here, the idea is that maybe you can alter people's, state of being by using the senses. And there's another kind of sub question here, which is like the visual hallucinations that you see, or the complex visual hallucinations that you might see in the psychedelic state. Could you explain these as basically the visual system driven in overdrive, quote unquote? There's a very specific sense. Deep Dream is an optimization of an objective. It's basically you start with some baseline image, And then you set it so that all of the subchannels in your deep neural network are cranked up as much as possible. So it just tries to drive all the units as maximum as possible. So is this like kind of a model of visual perception?
Right.
So I think that the second thing is probably like not as convincing, but could you create the same kind of state in which it feels strange to be in the strange visual world? I think that they showed that, pretty convincingly for what it is. But these are very small studies. There's just still like very early days. So I wouldn't say that it's entirely convincing, but it's one way that people are exploring.
Right.
This problem.
I think, the way I would look at it, consciousness it must have a functional utility for evolution to give us such a rich experience. So it'll be super interesting to see if we have two versions of a model, one without anything really matching anywhere near to consciousness, another having some sort of internal model that we can perhaps say it's inner world of that model. And if the latter has a better performance on some task which might be similar to survival tasks that human bodies perform, I think that will be pretty convincing for me. That
absolutely.
that the model is perhaps having its own internal world.
So one of the nice things there is that in integrated information theory, according to that framework, if you try to implement this in silico, you can simulate a consciousness, but the thing is not actually going to be conscious. So you don't have to worry about that. And I think that Chris Cock has like this whole argument about branching factors and how many things are connected to how many things. So, as long as we have like the conventional computers that we have, we don't have to be afraid of creating a conscious machine accidentally.
I guess we can keep going on and on about this, but this has been wonderful, Patrick. I think we've covered a lot, many interesting threads, and I'm really hopeful in the coming years, the model that you were talking about, integrating more and more aspects about how the brain works and building this one mega model. Hopefully we'll get there a few years from now.
Absolutely.
Great.
It was
Thank
great
you so much.
talking to you.
Yeah, great talking to you. Thank you. And have a great day.